Thank you very much. Welcome also from my side to this almost last panel of the conference. Before I say a few words what we will be talking about, I would actually invite all my panelists to come to the stage, so I'm not alone here, which feels awkward. You pick your chairs. So we'll be talking in this panel about a topic which has been mentioned. Go ahead, please, wherever you like. Pick your seat. Which has been mentioned many, many times over the course of these last 2 days. But we will now get a bit more special focus, and we will try also to kind of define what we are actually talking about. And it's also a topic which has been mentioned here, but is much less in the, let's say, public eye than all the other topics we'll have to be discussing here, like trade, security, innovation, and competition. So the topic we're going to talk about now in this coming hour is technical standards. And these technical standards are really, and I think we all agree here in the room, it has been mentioned many times, they're really of fundamental importance for our highly digitized societies. However, in our daily life, we are surrounded by them, but we normally hardly notice them. I actually thought about it yesterday when I was trying to find a charger for my phone and all the cables didn't fit. So normally we only kind of realize that we are surrounded by tech standards when they somehow do not overlap. And I also think that in the public and in the political debate, technical standards are getting much less attention than other kinds of standards, like regulatory standards or legal standards. So in this 1 hour, we will try to find out why this is the case, and why they are now becoming a concern of geopolitical conflict as well, and what we need to do about them. And I think one of the reasons why tech standards are getting less attention is because they're usually considered a non-political issue. But I think we will all agree, at least after this round, that they are very political in many, many ways. They are very political. And as an academic, I'd like to quote academics. And 25 years ago, the American legal scholar Lawrence Lessig said, "Code is law." And what he meant by this is really that the codes, the standards, the protocols on which our digital society runs govern our behavior and our society just as much as all other codes, like laws, regulation, norms, and all the things that governments and companies come up with. And so as technical standards, they really carry enormous power for the safety and also for the interoperability of our technical products. And whoever sets these standards holds this power. So I'm very happy that I have 5 very knowledgeable experts with me on this panel to discuss what we do with this power, how we best handle it, and what are the challenges that we are facing. In the interest of time, I will not go through all the very extensive and interesting biographies of my speakers. You have them in the booklet. You can look them up. I would just like to introduce them. So at the very end, we have Bill Echikson, who is the acting director of the Digital Innovation Initiative at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. And before, he also worked for Google, where he managed most of European YouTube content issues, if that's correct.
Sort of. In fact, not one person could deal with all of those content issues.
Then we have Riedel, who is a policy advisor for global digitalization innovation at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, and also the chairwoman of LOAD, the Association for Liberal Internet Policy. And many of us know her here in Germany as a very active civil society voice in the debates. Then we have Christoph Winterhalter, who since 2016, after a long career in product development, engineering, and so on, has become the chairman of the executive board of DIN, which is the German Institute for Standardization, and also currently acts as a vice chair policy for ISO, so the International Standardization Organization. So we actually have a standardization person on the panel, which is great. Welcome. Then we have Metin Hakverdi, a member of the German Bundestag, where he serves many other tasks I saw at the Committee of EU Affairs, and is also very active in the US-German exchanges, right? Welcome. And then last but not least, we have Daniel Andrich, who since 2020 is general manager at the American Chamber of Commerce in Germany, but before has been on the other side of the pond representing the interests of the German industry in Washington. Welcome to all of you. Yes, let's give them applause. I would actually kind of launch the debate by starting with a very simple question to the one man here coming from the engineering side who can help us to understand why technical standards matter. Mr. Winterhalter, in a nutshell, what are technical standards? What is the difference to legal standards? And why do we need to care as much about technical standards and all other kind of standards?
Thanks a lot for that question, and thanks for the introduction, because I feel extremely powerful after listening to your introduction. I mean, technical standards, they really define how the world ticks. But it's done by technical experts. It's not done by the political leaders. It's not done by company leaders, but it's done by the private sector. So it's private sector experts that actually specify how we technically implement the regulatory requirements we get from the political leaders. So the translation into something that we can measure from the technical point of view, something that really ensures compatibility, that's done by technical experts. They are mostly working in a hidden environment. Like in ISO, it's 150,000 experts in 167 countries that are actively involved in defining these technical standards. From children's safety to IT security and artificial intelligence, the whole range. And as a national standards body, we have the responsibility to manage the technical standards catalog for the country, for the European Union, and worldwide. So I mean, when I started in a German national standards body, I think this is a very German initiative. It's not 85% of the standardization activities that are run by the German national standards body are international standards. So we define the international technical standards that enable interoperability of components, that we have the same technical standards for cars that we manufacture in Germany and sell in the US and use parts coming from China. So that this works, we need technical standards. But they are really dependent on the active engagement of technical experts. So it's not kind of guarded by, let's say, political parties. They have to, of course, translate the regulation. But the technical details are actually specified in standards. And that really is important because it doesn't go through a political process. If a technology changes, we can very quickly adapt the standards, but still comply with the regulation. So if we have very fast evolving technology, it's required that we have standards that understand the regulatory environment and enable to use new technology under the same policy, but with new possibilities that are offered by these new technical standards. So it's very much about clarifying technical details on an international basis and help them to clarify the details on how to implement regulations. That was a long explanation.
No, that's, thank you. I think that was really helpful. And you said they're not developed by political institutions, actors. So why are technical standards then now becoming such a political issue? Maybe, Mr. Andrich, from your background in US, EU trade relations, what would you say? Why are national governments, including the United States, the European Union, of course, and China, are becoming so much engaged in this debate about tech standards right now?
Short answer, in addition to what Christoph Winterhalter just said, it is basically the sort of technical language of trade policy in general, in trade relation and commercial relations. That's what we as an organization, our members are very much focused on. How do we define the future of how do we do trade relationship? This is especially important for the German economic model, but it's also important for the US companies here in Germany and the US companies in the US and other countries. So yes, I do agree, and it's bringing technical experts together is at the end of the day the execution of what needs to be done also on the strategic and political level. That there is emphasis, that there are resources, that there's awareness that we need to speak about technical standards, we need to speak about manufacturing standards in general, if we want to create and shape a sort of global framework in general where businesses can flourish and extend their operations. That is extremely important, I think. So this has also a political dimension, I would say, as a transatlantic organization, and since we're here on the Transatlantic Conference, obviously this is also addressed in the Trade and Technology Council, which is great. I think we need political momentum there. it also needs to be sort of created the momentum here in the business community itself, that they put resources behind it. We see that there are countries in the world who are very active when it comes to this. You mentioned China, also in the bodies, at ESO and others. I do think that we need to raise the awareness here, and this is also what I would like to deliver here on the panel, but this conference, that this needs to be sort of perceived in the business community and the political landscape, I say.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Echikson, would you agree? This is, I mean, we feel like US, Germany, EU increasingly becoming interested in tech standards or being involved as well in tech standard setting. I think you also have an expertise on China. What do you see the role of China in all of this?
So as we discussed, I think the reason this panel is taking place, not in a tech standards setting with engineers, is because of China. And sort of the overriding fear that China will dominate the next generation of technology because it's very active in setting standards. And I think this cuts to the heart of the transatlantic debate about how to deal with China, and is, I would say, an exaggerated, over-exaggerated fear. I think the US is really using this to bludgeon China and try to kick China out or isolate it in the world economy, and that's not good for anyone because these standards are for everyone to build upon. And I think that they need to stay apolitical and out of this debate. I mean, to give you an example, we're talking of a couple of examples. One would be about Open RAN, the new telephone network where we're setting standards for the next generation, a new way of building telephone networks. Just because China is involved doesn't mean that it's necessarily dangerous, but having Huawei run the Wi-Fi here may be dangerous. So I think that we have to separate between the real risks and the sort of imagined overreaching risks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I was like, just from a German perspective, since we are here in Germany, from a German perspective, I always felt that tech standards are not really at the heart of public debate about digital governance in general. I don't know, Ms. Riedel, if you feel like you're very involved in digital policy debates in Germany, do you feel that there's something changing? Is the awareness growing that we need to speak about tech standards too, not only about regulation, be it on the EU level, on the German level, and so on, but also we need to talk about more about these technical kind of rules and codes and standards, and why is it now? I mean, we heard now a lot, why is it now? But what is, from your perspective, what is it?
Well, I think the public debate and also the political debate on standards is growing a lot. When we look at it not on the global perspective, but on the German perspective, for example, when we talk about e-government and the digitalization of our administration, there was just a paper published by Dean and other organizations on standards for municipalities and all the e-government softwares, because they recognize, we need to have standards, then it's hopefully much more easier to have all the software and cloud infrastructure and so on. But we put standards, and I wanted to look it up before the panel, what Hebel Projekt oder Hebel irgendwas is in English, leverage. It's one of the three things we have in our digital strategy from the federal government, because they recognize standards are a very, very important part, and it will leverage all the digitalization projects we have. And they recognized also the international perspective of standards, not only when it comes to e-government, but also the involvement in international bodies for standardizations. And I think because of the Zeitenwende and this now geopolitics coming back, and we as Germans also recognizing that there is something like geopolitics, we also start to talk about standards. And for example, with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, we published just a few months ago a paper on the discrete power of China when it comes to technical standards, written by Tim Rühlig from the German Council on Foreign Relations, because I thought we need a paper, and I asked him to write it very low level because I wanted to bring it into the political debate, to make it easy for everyone to understand what are standards, or what you were saying in the beginning, so that people are aware of this topic, because often we don't see standards and we don't see technical standards. We see the USB charger, for example, but not when it comes to AI and so on. And I think it's super important because, quoting another guy, Werner von Siemens, he said, who owns standards owns the market. And when we want to have, like we always want here in Germany and Europe, an ethical digitalization, we need to focus also on the products, and therefore the standards and ethical, that they are ethical and value human rights, for example.
Okay, yeah. And we hear China again. Before we come back up to speak about China, I would like to hear from you, Mr. Hakverdi, because we just heard standard setting is part of the German government's strategy right now. From your perspective, also being involved in the Committee for EU Affairs, do you have the feeling that there is this just written in there in the document, or is there actually, from the government level, something like a growing awareness? Is there more debate happening on the government level in political circles? Is this also something we see when it comes to Europe? Do you see that there's a growing awareness in debates about European policy that we need to get, as Europe, be more involved in standard setting?
So I did not major in computer science. I'm a lawyer. I have to apologize in this round for this fact. There is obviously a growing attention to this, obviously, and it was before February 24th last year. But obviously things have speeded up, that we see some sort of urgency because of political and not technical issues. To make this very clear, because I think there is a connection, and that's why we're sitting here, actually. Yes. And if it wasn't because of China, then it would be because of something else. Yeah. You have to answer that question for me, please. My chief of staff asked me that why those yellow lights of the French car industry. Yes, we ask him whether he knows or not. So looking back, standard setting was always a political issue, always, and obviously a technical as a given, but also politically, and that's why this dynamic has to change with the global changes also. So there are all the questions we have been asked before. The question is there a standard setting power in the East and a standard setting power in the West? And we have to sort of decide which standard we apply. The third countries as the global South, compared to our market access there, compared to the Belt and Road strategy of China. Is there a locking out of those markets? So those are all old questions, right? They are not really new. But I have a feeling that it is being that the momentum is now, obviously, because of the Zeitenwende, by the question of what do we learn from that conflict now for our relationship to China, and you can argue on the IRA on this issue, on protection, on the old protectional question. So the future, I would say, is in standards for political, to have a political approach on it. We should be aware of the situation, what could happen in a worst case scenario. I don't know how probable that is, but it would be a very bad situation if the European Union, speaking as a citizen of the European Union, if we had to decide of standards, that there wasn't a compromise-finding international body who would go on issues like, is it the best standard? Is it economically worth? Is it ethical standards in it? So other standards within the standards than just, it's a big market in the US, that's why we decide how it goes. We are the biggest country in China, so that's why we do it. So if that's possible or not. And I think there will be much pressure on that one. I can give you, just I tried to look up standards in the coalition treaty. Did anybody do that before this? I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware of it. So it's basically once in it, and it is in it under the European capital. So it is read, we want to increase Europe's strategic sovereignty. This means first and foremost establishing its own ability to act in the global context and being less dependent and vulnerable in important strategic areas such as energy supply, health, raw materials imports, and digital technology, without sealing Europe off. we will better protect critical technology and infrastructure, align standards and procurement accordingly, and initiate a European open source 5G, 6G consortium. We will better protect European companies against extraterritorial sanctions. So there's just aligned standards. It's just one small two-sentence in a very global aspect to it. But obviously the European Union is the point where and this will, I think, for German politics generally, will be the key issue to get this on the European stage and not on the national stage.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's very surprising that it's actually under kind of the keyword of digital sovereignty when everything what standard is about cooperation. It feels like it's kind of a contrast, which is probably the problem behind this whole digital sovereignty debate in any way. But since we talked about Europe, so there has been in 2022, Europe decided on a European standardization strategy. I see you nodding. I heard yesterday from one of your colleagues, to my big surprise, that when you do events on the standardization strategy, that there are about 1,000 people attending. Oh, yes. And I felt with all these digital, this package of digital regulations coming from Europe, the standardization strategy is definitely getting less attention than all the others. So why do you think this is the case? And why do you think it really matters, this new strategy?
I mean, it matters a lot, but I want to answer your question.
Yeah,
is there a mechanism in place to really fight for Europe's sovereignty without decoupling the word into different pieces and good and evil? Yes, it is. Yes, we can. That's what standardization is all about. That is consensus-based. It's really to find consensus on a technical level. What is China's intention? What is the US intention? What is Europe's intention? Is there a common ground? And that's what we discuss on a technical level in standardization. There's a regulatory discussion, what we want to regulate, what are the ethical values that we want to protect in Europe. But in the end of the day, they need to be translated into something that I can measure, because I want to certify that my artificial intelligence behaves correctly. It really values European values. But that is nicely said, but I really need to have a mechanism to really supervise what an algorithm is doing. And that is developed in technical standards. And that is an international community. I mean, we have a scientific community and we have an international standardization community. But as I said in the beginning, it's technical experts. And those technical experts, I mean, you are a computer scientist, I'm a computer scientist, so we can talk about some of the technical details. But this is not what the general public does understand. It just works. It's kind of a hidden workforce that fixes the details. But now it's becoming so critical that we need to raise awareness. And that's exactly what the European standardization strategy does. It tries to raise awareness that there is a mechanism in place. We just need to understand it and we need to utilize it. And China sits around the table, and they are not the evil force in standardization. They are actually a good corporate citizen to bring their own ideas, but with a force that kind of overwhelms, let's say, the representatives we have from Germany and from the US saying, but wait a second, now we have 20 Chinese people with a lot of good ideas. I don't even have the time to really digest what they are proposing, but that's not necessarily bad. So it's really to balance the amount of power China puts into the standardization around the technology areas where they want to be world leaders. And we need to complement that. And we can only do that if we raise awareness and we motivate, especially the private sector, to identify these are the strategic areas where I need to influence those technical standards. And that only works if they donate time, if they actually send their best experts to the standardization committees to find consensus with the Chinese people, with their US colleagues, to reach a common technical language that they can actually describe, and that will be the base of certification of products in the future.
I have two people immediately wanting to speak. Yes, go ahead, please.
Quickly on that, since you quoted the European sovereignty debate here, I say that, you know, as I started by saying that the standardization, harmonization in this regard, we consider very much as a trade policy topic too. I do think that it does not really make sense to only focus on the European debate. I mean, if it's true that the US is the biggest export market for Germany, one of the biggest trading partner, we're for the first time the second biggest investor in the US. US companies are highly invested in Germany, doing trade with Germany and European Union and the European countries. I do think, and as an AmCham position, we should really focus on, and as our members' position, to really get a transatlantic momentum there, which is stronger than by rather focusing only on the European debate and kind of an exclusive European debate, I would say. And this is, we can make it very specific. We have an IT Security Act which talks about trustworthiness in Germany. It's a Huawei debate, obviously, in the background of this, in the narrative on this, or the framework of this discussion. But I think, what does it mean transatlantically? How can we, in all these technical terms and regulatory terms, what do they mean for our allies or cooperation partners in the US and both sides on the other side of the Atlantic too? That we have sort of a mechanism that factors in how important the transatlantic relations are, not only in the broader sense when it comes to how do we, the values and the rule of law and these kind of things, but also on specific topics. And you can extend this, as you probably did in many other panel discussions, from the IRA up to sort of standardization topics. So I'm just wondering if we mean seriously, creating or shaping globalization through standardization too, we definitely need to focus on a transatlantic angle in this debate too, by reducing barriers, both tariffs and non-tariff barriers on the standards front, by increasing cooperation, and at the end of the day, by shaping, the standardization, through standardization, shaping sort of a globalization. I'm still believing in the globalization. Sorry, I might be one of the few Stormy I know will also believe in globalization, I'm very sure. But at the end of the day, if you want to stick with the sovereignty term, then I would rather argue should strengthen a transatlantic sovereignty rather than only a European sovereignty. I know you're not a huge fan of the term sovereignty, but in general, if we want to use that, I do think.
I see. Riedel, Anne-Kathrin Riedel was first, and then you, please, go ahead.
It's working, no?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay. To your question, why don't we really care about standards? First of all, I think it's a super nerdy topic, and mostly computer scientists or engineers are dealing with it. And so you're a lawyer. I studied Islamic studies, so something completely different. and I think it's important that it's coming to a political debate. And normally, I'm not the pessimistic one on a panel, but I think still digital policies are not a priority in politics and also not in the public debate. We always say digitalization is very important, but then we stop. And when we come to, you just mentioned the delegations China has and the delegations from Germany or the US in comparison, we see how unimportant it is for us Germans or Europeans or also the US, and we need to put more money, more stuff into these topics to bring it more on the table. And always make the comparison from digital policies to climate policies, for example. Both are topics we don't see. We only see why this topic is important when it's too late. And often I'm afraid that we only recognize how important these topics like standardization or digital policies on a global level and geopolitics when it is too late, when we have standards and put standards away, it's very difficult, I think, when there is, when China set too much standards in digitalization. So I don't like to be pessimistic, but I think it's too complicated, and we don't see it, and we don't see the implications of not acting in this field.
Okay, great. So we have an optimist believing in globalization. We have a pessimist. You raised your hand too, and then we have.
I was going to comment that you were reading the statement about the one mention of standards in the coalition agreement, and it was all mixed up with digital sovereignty, with all these other issues that really have nothing to do with standards, and are, for me, code words often for protectionism, or we want the data all localized and saved in Germany by a German standard or a European standard, and I think that is where we have the confusion between standards that are technical issues. How do you make a telephone network work? How do you make a payment system work or an automobile run? And the idea of industrial equivalence or competitiveness. And that's really dangerous. Within Europe, I would also say that I've often encountered regulations that require companies to do things but then have no standards by which to do it. So Europe put in a payments regulation where you had to double authenticate for security, supposedly, the purchase, but there were no standards to make that double authentication, so it's been a complete mess. We would talk at your e-government, digital identity. I've done some work on that within Europe. It's been struggling and struggling and struggling, and it really, in a sense, we can't get standards, but the basic problem with there is that Germans don't trust Greek certification. And so until we really, within Europe, I think there's a big problem of getting standards so that everyone really accepts the other's standards.
So, just for the global issue, not the European issue, because there's a lot of issues within the European Union. There are a lot of issues within Germany, so standard setting. But this is not the question about whether China is evil or not. Mm-hmm. If you argue with that, I think you are missing the point, and you just want to make your point that should not be a reason, and it's not. I think it's perfectly fair that everybody is trying to fight for their own interests and values. And there might be a difference in our interest and values to the People's Republic of China. So there's a difference. And then the question is how to compromise on that if you want to compromise. The other is, if you have standard setting in an international context, you have international political players and you have companies. And we had these arguments all over. A company in Germany is not the same as a company in China. So yes, formally, Huawei is a private company. I don't know any private company like Huawei in Germany. Because it's different. And it's not about being evil, it's about being different. So I give you an example outside the tech world, because I'm from Hamburg, and shipbuilding was the oldest shipbuilding yard in Germany, just closed last year in my constituency. Because we are not building ships anymore, others do now. And which is good, because that's globalization also. We would build ships much more expensive than others. We specialize in ships. But the standard setting for ship industry is also technically a private issue. There are several bodies to rule that, the IMO and others. And what happens is that the experts showing up there are experts. And if you don't have experts, they don't show up. So because we don't have shipbuilders, constructors, and engineers in Germany, not because we are good and China is evil, no, because we don't have them, not as many, they don't show up. And what happens then is that China, South Korea, by the way, and others are setting the standards, how a ship works, security issues and all that. And you know what, objectively speaking, that is good because they are doing it, not we are doing it, so they should decide on it, right? And they are really good because they are still building them. They are even better than we are. So objectively, there's good reason to listen to those guys who are building ships today. But I live in a city with a harbor where those ships go in. Standards are super important in interacting. So this is by building a machine. So maybe a ship is it's a little easier to understand what this is about. It's all about politics in this one. And for technology that is more differentiated, like the digital technology, it will be much, much more important than that. We would never, ever argue on this. Let's do an international setup for the standards of the F-35. We would not do that. Or for the Leopard 2. No cooperation. Why not? The Chinese build tanks. Why not? That will be better product for all, right? No, we wouldn't even think of that. And that is a super big problem that will be bigger because the Chinese government has pronounced its strategic goals and they will use everything to do that. We also do that. It's not a question of evilness, it's a question of different interests. And that's why I'm everybody is, are you all in the 4G net here in Berlin? Everybody knows it's 100% covered by Huawei, 100%. I think it matters whether that is a standard we can also comply with, or if it's just imported by others and not controlled. It's a super important issue. And if we don't have the ship industry anymore, we should probably do it by finance with public money to get experts in there to put our interest in that processing of setting norms. If we are not up to par in cloud computing and whatever the future brings, we have to be there. We have to be on the field in the first place. And we are not good at that in strategically posing those personnel into that field. And if somebody argues that's a question of private companies and not of evilness, I would say that is not a very sufficient description of the challenges of the future we have. And this is mainly China, of course, I'm thinking always China, but it could be also with the United States, but there might be a more aligned interest and value closeness to the United States, that's much easier. I would propose that, definitely. Depends on the government in the United States, actually, also, and what the people of the United States think, but generally I would say we are much closer to them on that one, because the Chinese goals have been proposed, and it is not that they are cooperating, it's by dominating markets in particular fields of science and industry. So we have to react on our own interests and values.
Yeah, I see your hand, and yeah, thank you. I see hands in the audience as well. So I just have a very quick follow-up question, because it was actually a perfect introduction to this last question of mine, which is about the difference. So there are differences in the way standards are set, or like how governments get involved in standard setting in the US, in China, and in Germany. And I think that was kind of where you're getting as well, was about public funding, putting public funding into these institutions as well. Maybe you can, since you wanted to say something anyway, maybe you can also
it was a very good trigger for a discussion. Where are we strong in standardization? Yeah. Where are we strong in our industry? That's like manufacturing. If I look at the manufacturing standards, Industry 4.0, that's kind of a German idea, and we are very strong also in standard setting in these areas. So it's a chicken and egg situation. If you're strong in standards, if you set the standards for the world, if you have a strong opinion and a good proposal in the international consensus building around how manufacturing is done, you end up being a leader in a global market. And that's kind of to protect the position of, let's say, the existing industrial base we have in Germany. But now if we talk about IT-related standards, it's much more systemic things. The question is, do we have the industry that can come bottom up with the resources to define those standards for the future? Or are we depending on where we have the expertise, like in the US with the big tech companies, or in China, where the government says, this is part of my strategy, to be an IT infrastructure leader, and they really encourage the companies to send their experts, and they have governmental funding programs to make sure it happens. But in our case, I mean, it's a private sector initiative. So we are depending on whether German businesses are really find it valuable for their business case to send experts and nominate them to be part of an international standardization process. But if it's the kind of the consumers, that it actually will be dependent on what kind of products, what kind of technology, what kind of services they can get in a safe way, I mean, they have a much weaker position to get involved in standardization, even though the process is there. So if we as Europe, if we as Western countries want to keep that momentum, we must have a mechanism to define what is important, and that needs to be a public-private partnership discussion. Because we need the experts from the industry, because they need to implement these things. They need to have the infrastructure to certify that certain products are according to those values. But it's a lot of work. And that's why we need to have a discussion, and that debate has been triggered by the European Union's standardization strategy. We have a counterpart now with the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, that they're really looking into how we can have a strategic discussion in Germany between the political parties and the businesses to see what is important and where we need to invest in standardization, to kind of not let it happen purely bottom up. If we have a company that has a business case, they send their people into standardization committees. But if it's now more systemic questions, like how we can protect the climate, how we can kind of accelerate the digital transformation, that's not the business case for one single company. That's a kind of societal challenges, but the actual solution happens in standardization. So it's about awareness and about motivating in a public-private partnership to send and nominate experts that they are sitting together with the Chinese, with the American colleagues and find out what's the common ground. Despite that there is different interests, there's different philosophies, but from a technical point solution, we should at least have the same way how to measure things and to qualify what can be used in Europe, what can be used in China, and what can be used in the US.
Thank you. Yes, I would have lots of questions, but we only have 15 minutes left, so I would like to invite the audience to ask some questions. I see, oh, it's really hard to see. I see one hand, which I saw first, I think, and then a second one over here. I think you need to go up to the mic, right? Oh, okay.
I have a short question to Metin. He has never been in Papenburg. That's correct?
In Papenburg?
Yeah, there's a shipbuilder there. Yes. Cruising pigs. Very sophisticated.
Actually, I was there.
Sophisticated. Well, we are a hamburger, you know. As we're saying in North Germany, Pfeffersack. Okay. The second is we have to make a distinction between the Chinese population and the Chinese government. Nearly 80% of all companies are belonging to the Communist Party. So 7% of the communist members. We have to realize it. So when we are talking about democratic things, we have to take this into account. Okay, in Hamburg, you have just given 20% away for the harbor to Chinese. Okay, it's peanuts for Scholz or these other guys. But we have to take into account that when you're going to Serbia and you see Chinese policemen looking for optimal places for cameras, when you're going to Africa, when you're aware that AI products are sold to African autocratic government, well, we have to think about it. You cannot just put and saying it's peanuts.
I didn't hear a question.
Thank you. I take immediately the second question, and then maybe we can have a round of answers.
And I'm actually rather shocked that nobody has mentioned standard essential patents. This is a big concrete issue. It's not a matter of speculation. It's a matter of international contention. The European Union has filed a complaint against China. The WTO just agreed to a panel in January. That panel is being put together. This is an issue that also involves tension between Europe and the US and China in a very complicated way. The US initiated the concept of anti-suit injunctions, that you could stop a proceeding in another country because you got there first. The UK, when it was still a member of the European Union, initiated the idea that that global royalty rates could be set by national courts. China has picked up on both of these. Europe has responded, not particularly framing the issues in the way that I just have, but in terms of the consistency of Chinese law. So this is a big issue on the table. The European Union, the European Commission has had a consultation on standard essential patents, particularly in the context of IoT, Internet of Things, because that's where a lot of small companies are running into patents held by large companies. And a recommendation on that is due this spring. This has been going on for several years, and it's a big, big issue.
Thank you. I feel like both were more comments than questions. Do you really like to react? Because we see other hands, but no?
I mean, that is a big issue, especially when it comes to telecom standardization. It's not an issue in the kind of a typical manufacturing type of standards area where we are active as ISO, but it needs to be settled. And I think the international standardization organizations are quite careful letting patterns being part of standards. So there needs to be kind of strict rules in place. And there is an ongoing discussion, and I fully agree, on how much patent-protected technologies we will let enter standardization without having a license kind of agreement in place that gives everybody access to this kind of technology with kind of fair conditions. Oh yes, when it comes to telecommunication standards. Fully agree.
Great. Then I see, yes, one person here. It's really hard to see.
Yes, thank you. Is this working? Yes. Julian Ringhoff, European Council on Foreign Relations. First, it's a bit unfortunate that just as we talk about tech standards here, there's actually a really interesting session by the United Nations, the High Representative on Human Rights. They're holding an expert consultation on the human rights implications in technology standard setting as we speak. It's very interesting. And in that context, I would like to ask the question, from my conversations that I've had so far with civil society organizations working this, but technical experts as well. And as you mentioned, there's this big problem that the Chinese, generalizing here, are sending a lot of people and putting a lot of resources into these standardization development or standards development organizations, especially ITU. And so far, from what I see, European Union member states are still mostly using the approach of sending someone with technical expertise from the Ministry for Digital Affairs, as well as someone maybe from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that's then 2 or 3 people, and that's certainly not enough. I know that the UK, for example, is really leveraging civil society, and there are civil society actors who have a lot of expertise, like Article 19, who then join the delegations of the UK government, and they're even empowered to speak on their behalf simply because the resources are so valuable to add them. But the UK is the only country that is doing that as far as I know in Europe, and it would be really interesting to hear if other European member states are willing to build such partnerships with capable civil society actors to support them in these, because everyone says it's especially resource intensive. You're basically constantly just watching what is being submitted by the Chinese and others, and you just need man and women power to, well, to survey everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Was it directed at one person in particular, or just the open? Okay, great. Do we take a second question before we answer? I don't see another hand. So you do have one.
I know that it's actually not so much my place to ask a question, but I do have to ask a question. And the question is really at the intersection, building on what we just heard, the intersection of technical standards and really value-based standards and human rights standards and so on. And I'm thinking, well, of the Chinese market again and autonomous driving. And very different standards being developed. But behind this are also different systems. We have an idea of liberty, I mean freedom, also freedom of movement and privacy. That is not so much the values on the other side in China. And I think companies need to decide if they want to be in the Chinese market, they need to follow these standards and implement those standards. But there might be also a line where companies also have to decide how far they want to go. And so I'm just throwing it at you again, the question, is it really that simple to say there are technical standards on one hand side and then there are those standards and regulations where we protect liberties, freedoms, values and so on, or if it becomes more and more interconnected?
Thank you. It's not a question easy to be answered, I think, but it's, we'll try, and I have a couple of questions as well coming online. Yes, go ahead.
Very short. First of all, my constituency is south of Hamburg, south of the river. That's where we make the money for those Pfeffersäcke to spend it, just to be on that part. That's where the industry is, where the low income is, and where the productivity of the city is. And then the picture you just designed is the ones north of my constituency, just to make sure on what side we are. It's not a technical issue only, but it has never been a technical issue only. So, there is no drastic new world to that one. What is new is the need to tie those, you said public-private partnerships, so to tie up civil society, the question in the corner, the technical issues and the economic interest into a standard that can cope with the challenges of the future. And one challenge is that China wants to dominate this. There's a government that has a strategic goal to dominate and not to make money with their companies. That's just a mean, that's not the goal. And that is for us very, very challenging. That's why I think the transatlantic relationship is in a special driver's seat. It's not an equidistant thing. We could go with US standards or Chinese standard, depends on the money side on our companies. No, this is much bigger. So this was an issue in the past, but it will be much more complex in the future because the need to twist it, that's why we're sitting here actually, is getting bigger and bigger by the day. And now we see what happened in Ukraine, and obviously the question is what we learned from Ukraine and the Russian Federation for our China policy is also adding up to this issue, amongst other issues as well. And we just have to get better up to par in our camp where we share the values and principles, because that will be something where we'll be different from China. We will be different. We can wish for the best, but it won't happen on my lifetime. So, and that is also a question of standard setting everywhere. This is not a technical, but this has never been a technical issue only, but it will be more and more a political issue on values and principles.
And just in addition to that, I mean, I would definitely underscore it is in our own interest. Also, it's not only sort of thinking about the holistic whole picture of where the world is going to end up at some point, but really the interest of US businesses, of German businesses, to really work together and create this momentum right now and shaping some form of sort of framework where we can work, and which is based actually on a shared values and shared sort of the rule of law and all these kind of more sort of framework related topics. But I do think that we really should focus on that. I'm just more a little bit worried that, not on this panel only, but the standardization topic is extremely important, but we also have this regulation and the Brussels effect on sort of leading by regulation that we're lacking in this discussion, not on this one maybe, but in general, a little bit the question around the European question around competitiveness here. That is extremely important also in this regard by sort of having a big wave on legislative impulses from Brussels, Digital Service Act, Digital Markets Act, AI, and so forth. You can go on, really thinking about what is the competitiveness advantage here in Europe and what can we combine together with like-minded countries. And for me, obviously, and our members, the US is extremely important in this regard.
Yeah. And I think like-minded countries is also a very good keyword, because we now talk about US, Europe, and China, but there are many other countries around the globe, right? So it's partnership is maybe one of the things we have not really discussed yet here, like what are other partnership options as well. And I got a question here, for example, as well, is how, when talking about transatlantic cooperation, how do the different approaches of the EU and the US affect cooperation between the two countries, the two regions. So, and I think you can extend this question to many, many other countries. So there are many different approaches to standard setting and so on. So that's also maybe a question we could ask. Maybe someone would like to.
For me to conclude, it was about the debate about autonomous cars. For me, I remember I was at Google when they pulled out of China because they didn't want to have their search engine censored and so forth. It's this, but here you have a case where it's about bits and bytes being able to communicate, and then the company has to make a judgment about what it does with the builds on top of that and whether it's compatible or able to continue in a place like China. And I agree that there are real challenges, especially when it comes to companies that are dealing with information and the exchange of information and so forth. So I think we have to separate this standards debate and the fears around it from the regulations and practices and policies that are built on top of the standards.
I see another hand. We actually have 1 minute left, so
Okay.
you'll be
Then
quick,
please go
and
ahead.
maybe no, someone else, like, go ahead. Then you go.
Oh, just to complement what you just said, I mean, if you're talking about international standards around kind of autonomous driving, it's more like define standards on data quality, which parameters to include. And then it's independent of the policy you put in place, where to store the data, who gets access to the data, but just make sure how to make it transparent. What is a data kind of frequency? What's trustworthiness of data? That should be a common ground. How we utilize it into certain regulatory environments, that is up to the legislator in those regions to define, but to have a common language. Otherwise, we would need to develop completely different technologies, and that is the worst case scenario. So that's why we need to build a bridge and disconnect somehow the pure technical discussion to kind of what connects these technical standards to regulation. So what does the regulator require in terms of minimum requirements on these technical standards? But they have a kind of a quality infrastructure in place that you can certify against certain parameters. And that needs to have a common ground across the globe.
I think that was a very nice final statement. So since we're running out of time, we'll take this as a final statement. And I thank you very, very much for your inputs. I thank the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.